Morning, everyone. Happy Mondays and welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's assistant editor, Jason Beattie. Morning, Jason.
Morning, Susie.
Hooray. We never know if some people are still there or not sometimes. So this is the People's Paper Review. Get into the comments, ask us your questions. The best ones get a News Agenda mug, not to be dismissed as just being mug at all. Now, what have we got today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on an investigation by our colleague Lucy Thornton on a school near Sheffield with more than 50 leaks in the roof, staff toilets that have been adapted for classrooms, and children who are both wet and freezing cold during lessons. Now, Wales High School gets less funding per head than schools in the south, even though it has a higher proportion of children on free school meals. And there's a quote from the head teacher, which I'm going to read to you in full because it's possibly the most devastating thing you'll hear about today. Pepe Diazio says, "It's hard to believe we're the world's 6th largest economy. We're in a 1970s building, and as we speak, the rain is pouring down. We will have more than 5 to 6 different leaks with buckets in classrooms by the end of the day. Children will be cold and wet, this at a time when we're keeping windows open to allow airflow to prevent the spread of COVID, and the heating's working overtime to keep the temperature at a level you can work in." Not ideal, I think everyone can agree, but it's all right, isn't it, Jason? Because the Prime Minister promised us when he was elected in 2019, and he promised lots of people in Sheffield as well, that he would level up the North with the South. So when's he going to start doing that?
Well, that's a very good question, because we were meant to get the government's levelling up plans in October, and then they got delayed until December. And then we were told we're going to come this month, but they may be delayed still further. So at the moment, we've got a very good slogan, but we have got no policies attached to it. And part of the problem is the government and the cabinet can't agree what levelling up means. So it's a nice idea, they think. But some think it means, kind of like doing something on crime. Some think it means kind of more devolution. That's kind of Michael Gove, who's the levelling up secretary. That's not a title from the thick of it. That's his genuine title. He thinks it's kind of giving more powers, but actually, and the Treasury thinks it's a wonderful idea as long as they don't have to spend any money. So we have. You're not going
to get to level up for free, though, are you?
No. And as you can see, the case for levelling up from this school in Sheffield is urgent, and it's really quite frightening. If you read this head teacher's words, it's not just the appalling state of the building, as you can see in that picture there, that teachers having to run around with buckets to catch the rainfall. It's the fact that COVID has put even more pressure on school finances. So they really are struggling.
Yeah,
and it's rated good by Ofsted. And parents, it's got really want to get their children into it, and they're doing an amazing job in the worst possible circumstances.
It's astonishing, really, that that's acceptable to the local education authority. But of course, these days they give money to the schools, and that's up to them how they spend it. And the head teacher there said, we've got to prioritise the people. We've had to pay for the staff. We've got to keep things COVID safe and all the rest of it, and pay for the heating. It has to be on full blast while the windows are open. We can't afford to pay for this as well.
And then you've got this additional problem, which a lot of head teachers will tell you is, because of COVID, they've had increased staff absences. Like every other profession, it's been hit by people having to take time off sick because they need to recover from COVID, and that increases the budget because they've got to get more kind of temporary staff in to cover for them. Then you've got all the extra money they need on school catch up. So there's additional burdens there. And as he says, he's having to decide, what do I do? Do I get rid of a classroom assistant? Do I put money into the school building? I mean, these are really tough choices he's having to make. And there's just not enough money there to do it. And if levelling up was going to mean anything, surely it would mean kind of fixing holes in school roofs.
You'd have thought so. And staff having to give up their toilets so that it can become a classroom is not even Dickensian, it's more Georgian, I would have thought. Now, Julie says, why don't you use money from more affluent areas to support the deprived areas? You know yourself, there's less need for services in the affluent areas. There are some horrible statistics in this piece, Julie, which prove you're absolutely correct. But of course, this is the kind of thing that Boris Johnson promised, isn't it? That he would use money from more affluent areas to support, he would sort of spread things out more evenly to level up. But politically, he just doesn't want to take cash from places like the home counties or London, because Cheshire and Amersham showed quite neatly that he loses votes there and loses seats and loses elections, and it's the Tory heartland. So the Tory heartlands don't want him to do it. The Tory Red Wall does want him to do it, and he's having to choose between the two, isn't he?
Well, and it gets kind of more complicated than that, because actually, if you look at the stats in the Red Wall areas, they're all going in a downward direction rather than an upward direction. So, for example, there was a study by a think tank called the New Economics Foundation just before Christmas, which showed actually average incomes in the Northeast have gone down by £250 per household per year since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, while they've gone up by £500 per household per income in more affluent parts of the country. So we're getting hammered there. I mean, there's lots of other stats I can throw at you. For example, expenditure on transport in Yorkshire and Humber is kind of marginal compared with the amount spent in London. You've got the figures we've got on the same page there on school funding, which is showing per pupil funding in the Northeast is almost £1,000 lower than it is in London. I mean, we have to acknowledge there's lots of deprivation in London, and it's we always kind of talk about the capital as being this kind of very, very wealthy area. It's not. There's some very, very poor parts of the city, but there's also this major problem of is the money being fairly distributed? And at the moment, it's not.
Yeah, there's also lots of state schools with state funding that can compete with private schools and do compete as far as parents are concerned in the south. I don't know the same is really true of Yorkshire. Now, keep asking us your questions. Get into the comments. Tell us what you think. What's happening at your children's schools? What do you think should happen with levelling up? The rich get richer and the poor get poorer, says Mandy. Now, during the pandemic, Tory MPs were amongst the loudest voices saying how important schooling was for children's and indeed the nation's future, our earnings, our social well-being. They were very much painted schools as the places where kids from the worst backgrounds could nevertheless improve their lot in life and contribute to the country, whether it's GDP or its society or anything else, have those opportunities. But presumably, Jason, those Tory MPs are today saying exactly the same thing about schools that aren't fit for human habitation, aren't they?
I mean, this is the classic problem with Conservatives is they want kind of world-class kind of German-style public services, but they want kind of Cayman Island levels of taxation at the same time, and they don't seem to realise that you can't have one without the other. And you look at as you said quite rightly, they're saying really important to get kids back into school. We've got a lost generation coming, and then we're asked to stump up the money. And, Sir Kevin Collins, who was the former catch-up czar who resigned in protest, he said we need at least 15 billion. Initially, the Treasury offered 1.5 billion. That went up to about 4 billion. But there's still this kind of, 10.5+ billion pound gap into between what's needed and what's being offered. And as I say, you come back to the same problem. The Conservatives just kind of have an ideological opposition to any form of tax rises whatsoever, but then can't explain why public services aren't in the state they need to be in.
No. So we got Mike there saying that levelling up is the new get Brexit done. It's just an empty slogan, which is thoughts that are echoed by Zane Powles, who's a award-winning teacher who's mentioned in the Mirror spread there that you featured before in the news agenda, who's delivering laptops in schools to food rather to pupils during lockdown. Pamela says the Tories only wanted children back at school so parents can go back to work. All of these things, I think, are probably true. But we've also got elsewhere today, Tory MP Ben Houchen, who's a bit noisy for a red waller and for a Tory. But he's writing in the Times today talking about how voters in that area need to see spades in the ground. They're realistic and know that levelling up can take decades. But they need to see the start of things if they're going to vote Tory again in 2 years' time. They need spades in ground. They need factories getting permission. They need energy. They need investment in infrastructure and so on and so forth. Does this show then, Jason, I suppose, that those Tory backbenchers, the new intake, the red wallers, are going to, I don't know, are they going to rebel? There's lots of talk about them maybe crossing the floor to Labour at some point if they want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of the crossing the floor. I'll be surprised if it happens. But you never know. There's always the odd kind of maverick MP who does something you don't expect them to do. But it is a warning sign to Boris Johnson. And what's actually happening here is he's being hit by this double problem. One is this failed to deliver on his promises, particularly as we see with levelling up, as a cost of living crisis is hitting, and they don't seem to have an answer to the cost of living crisis either. And it was interesting in the Ben Houchen article you just referred to. He linked the three things together. He linked where's the Brexit bounce? That seems non-existent. We'll come back to that in a second. Then he linked the cost of living crisis, and then he linked it to levelling up as well. And across the board, was this kind of unease amongst the Conservatives that all these great ideas, which were meant to come with a kind of Boris Johnson premiership, seem to be kind of dissipating in front of our eyes. I mean, you could argue, if you wanted to get into the Brexit debate, one of the reasons we're not being able to invest in levelling up is because actually the economy is suffering so much because of Brexit. But that's I don't think we're persuadable of that argument.
Yeah, well, exactly. Now, there's a couple of stats worth mentioning very briefly before we move on in this piece. So the first is that since 2017, funding in the most deprived fifth of schools fell by 1.2%, right? In real terms, they took 1.2% away from the schools that needed it the most, the poorest, most deprived schools. Funding in the best off schools rose by almost 3%. And in the wake of HS2 being cancelled, as Jason referenced there, in 2019 to 20, transport spending was £882 ahead in London and just £309 in Yorkshire and the Humpers, less than half. Transport, of course, very important if you want to get to school or work. But keep an eye on the Mirror for they've started this levelling watch campaign, levelling up watch, I should say, in order to see how this actually is going and to check the government's homework, as it were. So keep an eye on it and we'll see how that goes, shall we? Now, moving on to our next story. In a few weeks' time, any NHS staff that are unvaccinated will either be moved into roles that are off the front line or fired. Last week, the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, that's it happening there in the main picture, was confronted by a consultant working on the COVID wards who said he was unvaccinated and didn't want to get the jab, despite the fact that would mean he was very likely to get COVID, more likely to be reinfected and keep catching COVID, and highly likely to be isolating and off work rather than tending to the patients who need him. Now, Jason, in this piece, the TUC is saying they want this mandate delayed, because the NHS just can't cope if you have to get rid of all this stuff off the front line. Is that going to happen, do we think?
I don't think it is. I do understand the TUC argument. And I noticed, in the Mirror's editorial columns today, we raised the option of actually having kind of daily testing as an alternative. But I am personally really uneasy by somebody who works for the NHS rejecting the vaccine. In fact, I'm not sure I'd want to be treated by somebody who didn't want to have the vaccine. And it's not just COVID. Just imagine if they suddenly turned around and said, I don't want a vaccine for measles or I don't want a vaccine for months, or I don't, and they're meant to be the health professionals. They're meant to be people who are doing the best they can to keep people healthy and to cure them. And if they are questioning the efficacy of the medicine which they're meant to be providing, I'm not sure I want to be treated by them.
No, it does seem that this consultant, who doesn't seem aware of the latest science, which is showing that you're much, much more likely to be reinfected if he said to Sajid, I have antibodies, because he's presumably already caught it. But that means he's far more likely to be reinfected, something like 50% more likely to get reinfected by even the same strain, maybe future strains. And it means he's going to be isolating off work. He also seems unaware, and I think Sajid did really badly in not tackling him on this, that people who work in the NHS are already facing vaccine mandates and have done for years. Surgeons have to have a hepatitis jab if they want to carry out surgery. I mean, because the risk of infecting their patients and killing them is pretty severe. And even if you're in hospital and you don't have COVID, if your person who's treating you, or anyone near for that matter, a porter, is unvaccinated and you're there with something else, you've just had a heart attack or something, you're more likely to get COVID and then more likely to have problems with your heart attack recovery because you've got COVID and you've got blood clots and everything else. But I didn't go to medical school for 7 years and I know that. I can't believe that consultant, really.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand there will be some NHS staff who have kind of objections, let's say, for religious grounds. But if they have those objections, they really shouldn't be on the front line, in my opinion. If they refuse to have the jab, that means they are more likely, as you say, to get infected, which means they're more likely to put patients at risk. And if that's a situation, I don't think it's tenable that they should be allowed to continue working on the front line. I mean, the whole point of working in the NHS is to make people better, not to put them at greater risk. And so I can understand the argument totally in favour of the argument of actually having mandatory jabs in the NHS. As you said, it already exists for other conditions. Against this, there is this problem of staff shortages, which have been exacerbated by COVID, but surely the NHS has to set the example to the rest of the country.
Yeah, and I think if I was in a hospital and that consultant came up to me, I'd say, could I be treated by someone else, please? And could you stay quite a way away? Because I've managed to get through.
That's going to get tricky, isn't it, Susie? Can you imagine if we're going to start patients to start coming in and say, look, I want proof you've been vaccinated?
Yeah, well, that would be a bit of a sticky wicket, wouldn't it? Especially for that consultant. I haven't had COVID. I don't want to get COVID, but please stay away from me. If you want to not be vaccinated, it's your choice and your problem. But please don't pass your problem on to somebody else. That's the fundamental issue I think I've got with it more than anything else. So we'll have to wait and see, won't we, whether this gets delayed or not. I think there's going to be some umming and ahhing, because while it's something that lots of people are okay with, most of the public are okay with these vaccine mandates, and there are lots of medics all over social media today in some kind of concerted campaign saying you need to get vaccinated because so many people in our ITU wards are unvaccinated at the moment. It does seem to be that the NHS is going to have real problems if they're frontline staff that are unvaxxed at the moment. Now, Lynn says, can't you pass it on even if you're jabbed? Yes, in theory you can, Lynn, but you pass on less of it. So the infection in whoever you pass it to is going to be less of an infection than if you are unjabbed and got a high viral load and you're sneezing all over them. Also, if the person you're passing it on to is vaccinated, that again reduces the power of the symptoms. So if you're passing on a bit of a sneeze and they're vaccinated, what they're going to get is even less of a sneeze, in theory. I think we're right in saying that. Jason, you were saying before we came on air that you'd had COVID and you're triple jabbed. So you are exactly what the unvaxxed, the anti-vaxxers would say. You make the whole thing a complete waste of time. If Jason Beattie can get COVID after the booster jab, no one should be bothering getting.
And my reply to them would be, I felt absolutely rotten, and I would dread to think how bad I would have felt if I hadn't been triple jabbed. So it was pretty rough, even when you're jabbed. So imagine not being jabbed, and it'd be horrendous.
Yes, and remember as well that Jason probably caught that from someone who's unvaccinated. So worth bearing that in mind. Now, there is that. Thanks for that, Jason. We'll have to see how that goes with the NHS in the next few weeks. It's April that rule comes in, so watch this space. Now, there is some good news in the world, and we've hunted it high and low for you this morning, but we have managed to find a piece, and here it is. Now, if there's one thing Britain's renowned for, more than anything else, more than irony, more than sarcasm, more than the royal family even, it's its vast array of stodgy, sticky, disgusting, delightful puddings. From treacle suet sponges like my grandmother used to make to sticky toffee monstrosities, we all have our favourite. And now a competition's been launched to find a new one to honour the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. One which will make a 95-year-old's teeth drop out, right? It's got to be that bad. So, Jason, does this mean that the Queen is basically ordering us to eat more pudding? In which case, thank you, Mom. Yes. Or is this a very unhelpful move from a monarch who's of a nation whose obesity has caused us to have some real problems in the pandemic?
Yeah, I what she's trying to do is drive more people to the dentist, because we're obviously going to kind of come up with some wonderful pudding, which is going to be ridiculously sweet, have far too much sugar in it, and is going to undermine overnight the whole government's health drive of trying to eat more healthily. But we love puddings.
Yeah, more puddings.
And we should have more of them in our life. What sort of pudding is fit for a queen? I mean, there's kind of, we have Victoria sponge, don't we? So we kind of we could have a Boris cake, which would be kind of
coronation
podgy, slightly unedible.
She got coronation chicken when she was crowned back in 1952. It was chicken and sultanas and curry sauce.
Was that from her coronation?
That's why it's called coronation chicken.
Well, no, I'm just about our other coronations, and I was just wondering. I didn't realize it was that recent.
I'm pretty certain that was, it was 1952. I think someone can go and check anyway. I'm pretty certain that was our Queen's coronation chicken. If it's not, then it's her dad. It was certainly 20th century. But so we've had coronation chicken, we've had Victoria sponge.
What's your favourite pudding, Susie?
The next one. Pretty much. Now, if I was going to make a pudding for the Queen and she came round to my house, I would do my signature dark chocolate and marmalade bread and butter pudding.
That sounds really nice.
Which is absolutely disgraceful. I mean, it's just appalling. It really is bad. Yeah. But it's highly, highly, highly lovely. What about you?
I like a tart.
In Kent, in God's own country of Kent, we have a speciality called gypsy tart, which is not politically correct, but it's basically just sugar in a pastry base. Sugar and condensed milk.
Is that what it is?
Yeah, and it's amazing. If you haven't had a gypsy tart, anybody, and you see it anywhere, you have one. And then make sure you've got a doctor on standby, because you're going to need it. Now, let me have a little roundup of some questions. We probably kicked the beehive a bit this morning by talking about vaccines. So Anna says, why are we all commenting on medical matters as though we are experts? I don't know. Why are we? Surely if anybody's able to weigh up their personal choice on being vaccinated, it's highly trained medical staff. We ordinary people are just getting the basic, simply modelled facts. You're right, Anna, entirely. And you'd have thought that someone who's working on ITU wards would know all this. We're not commenting on medical knowledge. We haven't expressed any medical knowledge pretty much so far, apart from a bit about viral loads. So I'll plead guilty on that one. But it is up to that consultant what he does. But that does mean that he faces various rules from his employer, which that employer already makes similar vaccine mandate rules for other staff. So I'm not entirely sure he can complain too much, but we don't really want to do without the consultants, do we? Lynn says, we've had COVID now, both me and my husband, and we've had all our vaccines.
I'm afraid they're just part of a percentage. I mean, you get about 96% protection with 3 jabs, but then there's 4% of us, and I'm part of them as well, Lynn, who still managed to get COVID. In fact, I did all the right things. I wore my mask. I try to avoid public spaces. You can, Omicron is extremely transmissible. You can still get it.
Yeah, unfortunately. And just remember try and think about if you're feeling rough with COVID, or you've had it, or you're not feeling too bad, think about how much worse it would be if you didn't have the vaccine that would be giving your immune system a head start in dealing with it. It would be significant. I had a friend who had to go to bed for a few days, and she said to me, if I hadn't had the vaccine, I'd be in hospital. You'd be one step worse from whatever you are. So Sheila says, it will eventually be mandatory. They may be unknowingly adding to the whole scale of the problem in hospitals, a danger to patients, and why should they be fully paid if they're off sick with it? It's gone. I think Sheila was agreeing with us. Why should they be paid if they're off sick, if they haven't been vaccinated? Thelma says, sponge cake with royal icing. Total respect for the Queen. She's so dignified. Royal icing is basically just sugar and egg white, isn't it? And a sponge cake with some of that on top is pretty delicious. But I'm not entirely sure it's inventive enough, Thelma, for a platinum jubilee. But if it's going to be something platinum themed, I don't know. I don't really want a metallic sponge pudding. if I had to choose, really. But I'm sure there'll be something coming up when people invent something. Mike says, can we have Michael Gove being stuck in a lift as the good news item?
We could, but it'd be bad news for the person stuck in a lift with Michael Gove.
Yeah, but good news for the Department of Housing and Levelling Up and whatever else it is that he's running these days. Most of the government, it would appear. Kelly says, how many vaccines do we have to have? There'll be another one next year because they're making them now that are variant specific. So when we get fresh variants next year, we should be able to have fresh vaccines that will deal with it better than perhaps some of the rushed out boosters that we've had this year. Okay, I think that's pretty much a roundup. Oh, he's out of the lift. Hooray. What a shame. He's coming out of the lift. He's not coming out of anywhere else. Thank you, Jason, for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Join us on Wednesday for another edition of the News Agenda, and keep safe till then. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Susie.